What drove ordinary men to abandon civilized society for a life of constant danger and uncertainty? How did notorious outlaws like Jesse James and Butch Cassidy survive in a world where death lurked behind every rock and tree? What was it really like to live outside the law in America's most lawless frontier? Tonight, we'll uncover the brutal realities that these legendary figures faced every single day. Hello there, fellow history enthusiasts. Where are you checking in from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Whether you're settling in for the evening or finding a moment of calm in your busy day, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this time exploring the past with us. If you truly enjoy these boring history stories that help you unwind and learn something new, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to our channel. Your support means everything to our growing community of history lovers. Feel free to comment below about what historical topic you'd like us to explore next, or simply check in and let us know how you're doing. Each of you is an important part of this journey we're taking together through time, and I want you to know how much I appreciate your continued support and engagement. Before we begin our exploration into the harsh world of the Wild West outlaw, you might want to turn the lights down, maybe put on a fan for some gentle background noise, and get comfortable. We're about to embark on a journey to one of America's most dangerous and unforgiving frontiers. The daily struggle of an outlaw's existence. Picture yourself waking up before dawn, not in a comfortable bed, but on the hard ground with nothing but a thin bedroll between you and the rocky earth. Your back aches from another restless night, and you're immediately alert, scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. This is how every single day begins when you're living outside the law in the American frontier of the 1870s and 1880s. You are a wanted man, and that wanted poster with your face on it is nailed to every sheriff's office, general store, and saloon from Kansas to California. The price on your head means that every stranger you meet could be planning to collect that bounty. Every familiar face might have turned against you for the reward money. Trust is a luxury you can no longer afford, and paranoia becomes your constant companion. Your stomach growls with familiar hunger as you roll up your bedding. Food is scarce when you can't walk into a town and buy supplies like a normal person. You've been living off whatever you can hunt, steal, or barter for, and it's never enough. That rabbit you caught 2 days ago is long gone, and your last can of beans was finished yesterday morning. The weight you've lost since taking to the outlaw trail is evident in how loose your clothes have become, how your belt needs to be cinched tighter each week. As you saddle your horse, you notice she's favoring her left front hoof again. A lame horse is a death sentence for an outlaw, but you can't exactly take her to the local blacksmith for proper care. You'll have to examine the hoof yourself, hoping it's just a stone lodged in there and not something more serious. Your horse isn't just transportation, she's your lifeline, your escape route, your most valuable possession. Without her, you're a sitting duck for any lawman or bounty hunter tracking you. The morning routine of breaking camp is always rushed and anxious. You can't afford to linger anywhere too long, can't build a proper fire for warmth or cooking, because the smoke might give away your position. Every movement must be calculated, every decision weighed against the constant threat of capture or death. You've learned to eat cold food, sleep with one eye open, and never, ever get comfortable. Your clothes haven't been properly washed in weeks. The luxury of hot water and soap is a distant memory, replaced by the occasional cold stream or river where you might risk a quick rinse if you're certain no one is tracking you. The smell of your own unwashed body mingles with the odor of your horse. Gunpowder and the general filth that accumulates when you're living rough. Your hair has grown long and unkempt, your beard scraggly and matted. The dapper appearance you might have maintained in your previous life is long gone. The isolation weighs on you more than you expected. Humans are social creatures, but as an outlaw, meaningful connections become nearly impossible. Every person you meet is either a potential threat or someone you might endanger by associating with them. The loneliness gnaws at you during the long hours riding across empty plains, when the only sound is the rhythmic clip-clop of your horse's hooves and the whistle of wind across the grassland. Your hands are permanently stained and calloused from handling rope, reins, and weapons. Blisters have formed and reformed so many times they've become permanent ridges on your palms. Your fingernails are black with dirt that you can never quite scrub clean. And small cuts and scrapes cover your knuckles from the constant manual labor of survival. These aren't the soft hands of a gentleman, they're the working hands of someone who must do everything for himself. The weather is your enemy as much as any lawman. In summer, the sun beats down mercilessly, and there's precious little shade to be found on the open range. Your lips crack and bleed, your skin burns and peels, and the heat creates mirages that make you question what you're seeing on the horizon. Is that a dust cloud from approaching riders, or just another trick of the desert air? In winter, the cold penetrates every layer of clothing you own, which isn't much. You've learned to stuff newspaper into your boots for insulation, to wrap your hands in rags to prevent frostbite, to huddle against your horse for warmth during the worst storms. Water is always a concern. You carry what you can in canteens and water skins, but it's never enough for both you and your horse during the long stretches between reliable water sources. You've learned to recognize the signs of water in the landscape, to follow animal trails toward streams, to collect dew in cloth when you're desperate. Dehydration is a constant threat, making you dizzy and weak when you need to be at your sharpest. Your weapons require constant maintenance that you must perform yourself. Gunpowder needs to stay dry, bullets must be counted and rationed, revolvers cleaned and oiled regularly to prevent jamming when your life depends on them. You've become an expert at field stripping and reassembling your firearms by feel, often in complete darkness to avoid being spotted. The weight of your gun belt reminds you constantly of the violence that defines your existence. Sleep, when it comes, is fitful and brief. You've trained yourself to wake at the slightest unusual sound, the snap of a twig, the whinny of a horse in the distance, the call of a night bird that might not be a bird at all, but a signal between pursuing lawmen. Your dreams, when you manage to have them, are filled with gunfights, gallows, and the faces of people you've wronged. You wake more tired than when you lay down. The psychological toll of constant vigilance is exhausting. Your nerves are frayed from months or years of looking over your shoulder, of analyzing every situation for threats, of making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between freedom and capture, between life and death. You've developed a twitch in your eye from squinting into the sun, scanning the horizon. Your jaw aches from clenching your teeth during tense moments, which have become most moments. Medical care is non-existent for someone in your position. That bullet wound in your shoulder from your last robbery healed crooked because you had to treat it yourself with whiskey and whatever clean cloth you could find. The infection that followed nearly killed you, leaving you delirious with fever for days while hiding in a cave, praying no one would find you in your weakened state. Dental problems go untreated, stomach ailments are endured, and injuries that would heal properly with rest and care become permanent disabilities when you can't afford to stop moving. Your horse needs care too, and veterinary knowledge becomes essential for survival. You've learnt to recognize signs of colic, lameness, and fatigue in your mount. You know how to wrap a sprained fetlock, how to pick stones from hooves, how to treat saddle sores before they become infected. Your horse's health is so intertwined with your own survival that you often give her the last of the water, the best of the grass, even when you're suffering yourself. The constant movement means you never get to know a place well enough to feel at home. Every canyon, every town, every waterhole is just a temporary stop in an endless journey to nowhere. You can't put down roots, can't build relationships, can't accumulate possessions beyond what you can carry. Your entire life fits in your saddlebags, and even then, you're probably carrying too much. Communication with the outside world is nearly impossible. You can't send letters to family members without revealing your location. You can't read newspapers regularly to stay informed about what's happening in the world. Information reaches you as rumors and second-hand gossip from the occasional friendly contact. But you're never sure what's true and what's exaggeration. The moral weight of your choices follows you everywhere. Perhaps you started down this path for reasons that seemed justified at the time. Revenge for some wrong done to you or your family, economic desperation that drove you to crime, or simply the thrill of rebellion against authority. But now, months or years later, the original motivation feels distant and hollow compared to the daily reality of survival. You've done things you never thought you'd do, hurt people who didn't deserve it, stolen from families who had little to begin with. Every sunrise brings new dangers and new decisions. Do you risk approaching that isolated farmhouse for supplies, knowing the farmer might recognize you? Do you trust that fellow traveler you met on the trail, or assume he's working with the law? Do you help that stranded family fix their broken wagon wheel, even though it means exposure and delay? These aren't abstract moral questions. They're life and death calculations you make dozens of times each day. Your reputation, whether deserved or exaggerated, precedes you everywhere. Stories of your exploits spread faster than you can travel, growing more dramatic with each telling. You might hear your own legend recounted in a saloon, barely recognizing yourself in the tales of superhuman marksmanship and daring escapes. This notoriety is both a curse and occasionally a tool. Some people flee at the mention of your name, making robberies easier. Others seek you out, looking to prove themselves by taking down a famous outlaw. The weather isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous when you have no shelter to retreat to. Flash floods can trap you in canyons with no escape route. Blizzards can leave you lost and freezing with no landmarks to guide you home. Tornadoes on the open plains offer no place to hide. You've learned to read the sky like a book, to recognize the signs of approaching storms, and seek whatever shelter you can find, even if it's just the windbreak offered by your horse's body. This is your existence as a Wild West outlaw, a daily grind of survival, paranoia, discomfort, and moral compromise that bears little resemblance to the romantic adventures depicted in dime novels and Hollywood films. Every dawn is a victory, every sunset a relief, and every decision a calculation weighted against the constant possibility that this day might be your last as a free man, or your last day alive. Your relationship with money becomes complicated in ways you never anticipated. While you might occasionally score big in a bank or train robbery, most of your income comes from small, desperate thefts that barely keep you alive. That $20 gold piece you took from a traveling merchant's saddlebag feels heavy in your pocket. Not just from its weight, but from the knowledge of how hard that man worked to earn it. You tell yourself he can afford the loss, that he probably cheats his customers anyway, but the guilt gnaws at you during the quiet moments. The coins and bills you do manage to accumulate are often useless anyway. You can't exactly walk into most establishments and make purchases when half the territory is looking for you. Your money sits hidden in your saddlebags, growing slowly but remaining largely unspendable. You've become wealthy in paper and metal, but poor in everything that actually matters for survival. Food, shelter, safety, companionship. When you do manage to spend money, it's usually through intermediaries who take a hefty cut for the risk of dealing with you. That new pair of boots you desperately need costs twice what they should because the trader knows you have no other options. The information about pursuing lawmen costs you more than most people make in a month. But without it, you're riding blind into potential ambushes. The knowledge that you can never go home weighs on you constantly. Your family's farmhouse, the town where you grew up, the church where you were baptized, all these places are forever closed to you now. You think about your mother's cooking, your father's advice, your siblings' laughter, and the ache of loss becomes almost physical. Every holiday, every birthday, every family milestone happens without you, and you receive news of these events, if at all, through coded messages and whispered conversations with sympathetic contacts. Your former friends have moved on with their lives, while yours remains frozen in this cycle of flight and survival. They've married, started families, built businesses, and established themselves in their communities. You hear about their successes through the grapevine, each story a reminder of the normal life you abandoned or that was taken from you. Some of these old friends would still help you if you asked, but you can't bring yourself to endanger them by making contact. The lack of purpose beyond mere survival begins to erode your sense of self. In your previous life, whatever it was, you had goals, ambitions, dreams of what you might become. Now your entire existence is reduced to the immediate questions of where to sleep, what to eat, and how to avoid capture. The higher aspirations that make life meaningful have been stripped away, leaving only the animal imperative to keep breathing for one more day. Your personal hygiene deteriorates to levels that would have horrified your younger self. Bathing is a rare luxury that requires finding a secluded water source, ensuring no one is tracking you, and risking the vulnerability of being unarmed and unclothed. You've learned to tolerate your own stench, the itching of unwashed skin, and the discomfort of clothes that haven't been properly cleaned in weeks or months. Your teeth, once cared for regularly, now ache with cavities and gum disease that you can do nothing about. The seasonal changes bring their own particular challenges that you must navigate without the preparations and protections available to settled people. Spring rains turn trails into impassable mud that can trap your horse and leave you stranded in exposed territory. Summer heat requires finding water sources that may have dried up since you last passed through an area. Autumn brings shorter days that limit your travel time and force you to make camp earlier, increasing the risk that pursuing lawmen might catch up to you overnight. Winter is simply a months-long battle against cold that penetrates every layer you own and makes every morning a test of whether you can force your frozen fingers to work well enough to saddle your horse. The constant exposure to the elements has aged you prematurely. You look in a rare mirror, perhaps in the window of a distant store, and barely recognize the weathered, gaunt face staring back at you. Your skin has been burned dark by the sun and cracked by wind and cold. Lines have appeared around your eyes from squinting into harsh light. Your hair, once thick and well-groomed, is now thin and brittle from malnutrition and lack of care. You look 20 years older than your actual age, and you feel even older than you look. The emotional numbness that develops as a survival mechanism begins to concern you during your rare moments of self-reflection. You've witnessed and participated in violence that should horrify you, yet you feel almost nothing. The death of companions barely registers anymore. The suffering of your victims becomes abstract, disconnected from the emotional response that should accompany such actions. You wonder if this deadening of feeling is permanent, if you'll ever be capable of normal human emotion again, assuming you survive long enough to find out. Your dreams, when they come, are a confused mixture of past, present, and imagined futures. You dream of the life you left behind, but with disturbing alterations that reflect your current reality. You dream of capture and hanging, experiencing the rope around your neck with such visceral intensity that you wake gasping for air. You dream of impossible escapes to places where no one knows your face and you can start fresh. Though even in dreams, you know these fantasies can never become reality. The acoustic landscape of your existence is dominated by sounds that trigger instant alertness and fear. The distant sound of multiple horses means potential pursuit. The crack of a breaking branch might be a lawman positioning himself for ambush. The call of a bird at an unusual hour could be a signal between members of a posse. You've become hypervigilant to every sound in your environment, unable to simply hear birdsong or wind through grass without analyzing it for threats. This constant auditory scanning is exhausting, but has become so automatic you're not sure you could stop doing it, even if you wanted to. Your sleep patterns have been permanently altered by the demands of outlaw life. You've learned to function on 3 or 4 hours of rest, catching short naps during the day when you can find concealment. Real sleep, the deep, restorative kind that leaves you feeling human again, is a luxury you experience maybe once or twice a month when you find a truly secure hiding place. The chronic exhaustion affects everything. Your reflexes are slower, your judgment cloudier, your patience thinner. The isolation extends beyond just physical loneliness. You're cut off from the shared experiences that bind communities together. You don't know who won the last election, what new songs are popular, which businesses have opened or closed in the towns you used to frequent. The world continues to change and evolve while you're frozen in a cycle of survival and evasion. When you do overhear conversations about current events, you feel like a ghost listening to the living discuss a world you no longer belong to. Your horse becomes your only consistent relationship, and you find yourself talking to her more than you've ever talked to most humans. She knows your moods, responds to your voice, provides the only unconditional companionship in your life. You've shared more hardships with this animal than with your own family members. When she's injured or sick, your anxiety reaches levels that surprise you. Losing her wouldn't just mean losing transportation, it would mean losing your only friend. The constant stress manifests in physical ways you didn't expect. Your hair has begun graying prematurely. Your hands shake slightly from too much coffee and too little proper food. And you've developed a persistent cough from sleeping on the ground in all kinds of weather. Your body is aging at an accelerated pace, wearing down under the constant pressure of survival. Even your memories begin to feel unreliable after months of isolation and stress. Did that conversation with your brother really happen the way you remember it, or has your mind embellished the details? Was your childhood home actually as warm and comfortable as it seems in your recollections? Or are you romanticizing a past that drove you to this desperate present? The line between memory and wishful thinking becomes increasingly blurred. The reality of outlaw life in the American frontier was far removed from the glamorous image that would later capture the public imagination. It was a harsh, unforgiving existence that tested every aspect of human endurance and ultimately claimed most of those who chose to live outside the law. The rise and fall of Jesse James, America's most notorious outlaw. As we transition into our second exploration tonight, we turn our attention to perhaps the most famous outlaw in American history, a man whose name became synonymous with the Wild West's lawless spirit. Jesse Woodson James was not born to be a criminal, yet circumstances, choices, and the brutal realities of post-Civil War America would transform him into a legend whose story continues to captivate us more than a century after his death. Born on September 5, 1847, in Clay County, Missouri, Jesse James entered a world already fracturing along the lines that would soon tear the nation apart. His father, Robert James, was a Baptist minister and hemp farmer who owned several enslaved people, placing the family firmly within Missouri's pro-slavery establishment. When Jesse was just 3 years old, his father left for California during the gold rush, seeking fortune to support his growing family. Robert James never returned, dying of illness in the gold fields and leaving behind a widow, Zerelda, and 3 young children. Zerelda James was a formidable woman who would prove instrumental in shaping her son's destinies. Standing nearly 6 feet tall with piercing blue eyes and an iron will, she remarried twice, first to Benjamin Sims, who died within a year, and then to Dr. Reuben Samuel, a quiet physician who provided stability for the household. The Samuel family farm in Kearney, Missouri, would become Jesse's childhood home and later serve as his refuge during his outlaw years. The idyllic rural childhood that Jesse might have enjoyed was shattered when the Civil War erupted in 1861. Missouri became a battleground between Union and Confederate forces, but the conflict here took on a particularly vicious character. Rather than organized armies facing each other across defined battle lines, Missouri witnessed a brutal guerrilla war that pitted neighbor against neighbor, family against family. Jesse's older brother, Frank, was the first to join the Confederate cause, enlisting with the Missouri State Guard in 1861. But as Union forces gained control of much of Missouri, Frank and many other Confederate sympathizers turned to guerrilla warfare, joining irregular units that operated outside the conventional rules of war. These guerrilla fighters, known as bushwhackers, employed tactics that blurred the line between military action and outright terrorism. In 1863, when Jesse was just 16 years old, Union militiamen raided the Samuel family farm. They were searching for information about Frank's whereabouts and suspected Confederate activities. The militiamen tortured Dr. Samuel, nearly hanging him from a tree to force him to reveal what he knew about local bushwhackers. They also severely beat young Jesse and arrested his stepfather, imprisoning him without charges for several months. This traumatic experience radicalized Jesse completely. The Union soldiers he had been raised to see as foreign invaders had violated his home, brutalized his family, and shattered any remaining faith he might have had in lawful authority. Within months of the raid, Jesse James had joined one of the most notorious guerrilla units operating in Missouri, Quantrill's Raiders, led by the charismatic and ruthless William Clark Quantrill. Quantrill's Raiders were far more than simple Confederate irregulars. They were a band of young men, many still teenagers like Jesse, who had been brutalized by the war and had embraced violence as both a means of survival and a form of revenge against their perceived enemies. Under Quantrill's leadership, they developed a reputation for ferocity that terrified Union supporters throughout Missouri and Kansas. Jesse's initiation into guerrilla warfare came during some of the conflict's most savage episodes. He participated in raids on Union supply lines, attacks on isolated farms belonging to Union sympathizers, and ambushes of federal patrols. The guerrilla war in Missouri followed no gentleman's rules of engagement. Prisoners were rarely taken, civilians were considered legitimate targets, and atrocities on both sides escalated throughout the conflict. The pinnacle of this brutality came on August 21, 1863, when Quantrill led his raiders in an attack on Lawrence, Kansas, a stronghold of anti-slavery sentiment. Jesse James, barely 16 years old, rode with the 450 guerrillas who descended on the sleeping town at dawn. What followed was one of the most horrific massacres of the Civil War. The raiders systematically murdered every man and boy they could find, ultimately killing approximately 180 civilians and burning much of the town to the ground. For Jesse, Lawrence was both a formative trauma and a defining moment. He witnessed and likely participated in acts of violence that would have been unthinkable to the minister's son he had been just 2 years earlier. The psychological impact of such experiences on young men barely out of childhood cannot be overstated. They learned that violence was an acceptable solution to political disagreements, that civilian populations were legitimate targets, and that survival often depended on striking first and showing no mercy. As the war continued, Jesse's reputation within the guerrilla ranks grew. He proved himself an exceptional horseman and marksman, skills that would serve him well in his later outlaw career. More importantly, he demonstrated the cold courage and tactical intelligence that marked the most dangerous bushwhackers. By 1864, he was riding with Bloody Bill Anderson, perhaps the most feared guerrilla leader in Missouri, a man whose psychological instability and taste for violence exceeded even Quantrill's. The war's end in 1865 brought no peace for former bushwhackers like Jesse James. Unlike regular Confederate soldiers who could surrender, receive paroles, and attempt to rebuild their lives, guerrilla fighters found themselves permanently marked as outlaws. The provisional government of Missouri offered no amnesty for bushwhackers, and many Union veterans and officials nursed grudges against the men who had terrorized their communities during the war. Jesse's attempt to surrender in May 1865 ended in disaster. Approaching Union forces under a white flag near Lexington, Missouri, he was shot in the chest by a Union cavalryman who either didn't see the flag or chose to ignore it. The wound was severe, puncturing his lung and nearly killing him. He managed to escape and make his way back to the Samuel family farm, where his mother and stepfather nursed him back to health over several months. During his recovery, Jesse had time to contemplate his future in a world that seemed to offer no legitimate place for former bushwhackers. The skills he had learned during the war, horsemanship, marksmanship, small unit tactics, and the ability to live rough, were not easily transferred to peaceful occupations. More fundamentally, the psychological wounds of the war years ran too deep to simply forget and move on. The James family's financial situation also influenced Jesse's decisions. The war had devastated Missouri's economy, and the Samuel farm struggled to remain profitable. Federal authorities had seized much of the family's property, claiming it as compensation for guerrilla activities. The prospect of scratching out a living as a small farmer held little appeal for a young man who had tasted the excitement and camaraderie of guerrilla warfare. It was during this period of uncertainty that Jesse reconnected with other former bushwhackers who were facing similar challenges. Cole Younger, Jim Younger, and other veterans of the guerrilla war found themselves equally adrift in post-war Missouri. These men had formed bonds during the conflict that transcended ordinary friendship. They had saved each other's lives, shared unimaginable dangers, and developed a loyalty forged in blood and violence. The idea of forming an outlaw band probably emerged gradually rather than as a single decision. Former bushwhackers were already living outside respectable society, and many had turned to small-scale theft and violence simply to survive. The leap from survival crimes to organized banditry was perhaps inevitable for men with their particular skills and circumstances. The first crime definitively attributed to Jesse James and his associates occurred on February 13, 1866, when they robbed the Clay County Savings Association in Liberty, Missouri. The robbery bore all the hallmarks of military planning. an execution that would characterize the James Gang's operations for the next 16 years. The outlaws struck in broad daylight, used overwhelming force to intimidate resistance, and escaped using predetermined routes and relay stations. More significantly, the Liberty robbery established the pattern of violence that would define the James Gang's career. During the escape, one of the robbers shot and killed an innocent bystander, a college student named George Wymore, who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. This casual willingness to kill civilians set the James Gang apart from many other outlaw groups of the period and reflected the brutal lessons learnt during the guerrilla war. Over the following months, Jesse James emerged as the leader of what newspapers began calling the James Younger Gang. The group included his older brother Frank, the younger brothers Cole, Jim, John, and Bob, and various other former bushwhackers and Confederate sympathizers. Their targets were carefully chosen: banks in Republican-dominated towns, businesses owned by Union veterans, and financial institutions that represented the new economic order emerging in post-war America. The gang's operations demonstrated sophisticated planning and intelligence gathering. They would study their targets for weeks or months before striking, learning the habits of bank employees, the schedules of local law enforcement, and the layout of escape routes. Jesse proved particularly adept at cultivating a network of sympathizers and informants throughout Missouri and surrounding states, people who provided information, supplies, and safe houses in exchange for money or ideological sympathy. The James Gang's first few years of operations were remarkably successful. Between 1866 and 1869, they robbed at least 8 banks and several individual targets, accumulating what was then a considerable fortune. More importantly, from Jesse's perspective, they had established themselves as symbols of resistance to the Reconstruction-era social and political changes that many former Confederates found intolerable. Jesse James was not merely a common criminal seeking easy money. He saw himself, and was seen by many supporters, as a continuation of the Confederate cause by other means. His targets were almost exclusively businesses and institutions associated with Republican politics and Union veterans. His public statements, delivered through sympathetic newspaper editors, framed his activities in political rather than criminal terms. This political dimension of Jesse's outlaw career cannot be understated. Throughout Missouri and other former Confederate states, he was viewed by many as a folk hero, a symbol of resistance to federal authority and Northern economic domination. Former Confederate officers publicly defended him. Newspaper editors wrote editorials supporting his cause, and ordinary citizens provided assistance and protection even when substantial rewards were offered for his capture. The transformation of Jesse James from traumatized teenager to legendary outlaw was complete by 1869, but it came at an enormous personal cost that would only become fully apparent in the years to follow. The skills that made him a successful bandit also isolated him from normal human relationships. The violence that brought him fame also brought endless enemies, and the political causes that justified his crimes were ultimately lost causes that could never be won through robbery and murder. By 1870, the pressures of outlaw life were beginning to show on Jesse and his gang. The initial euphoria of successful robberies and dramatic escapes had given way to the grinding reality of constant pursuit. Alan Pinkerton's famous detective agency had been hired by the railroads and banking interests to hunt down the James Gang, bringing professional investigative techniques and unlimited resources to bear against the outlaws. The Pinkerton agents proved far more persistent and methodical than local sheriffs and part-time posses. They established networks of informants, used innovative surveillance techniques, and most importantly, they had the financial backing to pursue the gang across state lines for months at a time. Jesse found himself facing opponents who were every bit as skilled and determined as he was, but who operated within the law and had access to resources he could never match. The escalating conflict with the Pinkertons led to increasingly desperate measures on both sides. In January 1875, Pinkerton agents surrounded the Samuel family farmhouse, believing Jesse and Frank were hiding inside. When the family refused to surrender the supposed fugitives, the agents threw an incendiary device into the house. The explosion killed Jesse's 8-year-old half-brother, Archie, and blew off their mother Zerelda's right arm. This attack on his family marked a turning point in Jesse's psychological state. The death of innocent Archie and the maiming of his mother transformed his anger from a political crusade into a deeply personal vendetta. The boundary between Jesse, the idealistic Confederate partisan, and Jesse, the vengeful killer, dissolved completely. His subsequent crimes showed a level of brutality and recklessness that alarmed even his longtime supporters. The gang's activities also began attracting unwanted attention from federal authorities. What had once been viewed as a local Missouri problem now involved interstate commerce, railroad interests, and federal jurisdiction. The James gang found themselves pursued not just by county sheriffs and private detectives, but by federal marshals backed by the full power of the United States government. Jesse's personal relationships suffered under the strain of his outlaw lifestyle. His courtship of his first cousin Zerelda, Amanda Mims, whom he called Z, was conducted under extraordinary circumstances. Their meetings had to be arranged in secret, often in remote locations or through intermediaries. When they married in 1874, the ceremony was held quietly at the home of Z's sister, with Jesse constantly alert for signs of approaching lawmen, even during his own wedding. The couple's early married life was a series of furtive relocations and assumed identities. Zhao lived under constant fear that each day might bring news of her husband's death or capture. She bore their children, Jesse Edward, in 1875, and later Mary Susan and Montgomery, while knowing that their father's profession made their family's future perpetually uncertain. The psychological toll on Z was enormous, as she watched the gentle young man she had fallen in love with become increasingly paranoid, violent, and emotionally distant. Jesse's relationship with his brother Frank also grew strained as the years passed. Frank had always been more cautious and thoughtful than his younger brother, and he began questioning the wisdom of continuing their outlaw career as the risks escalated and the political justifications became increasingly hollow. The bond forged during their bushwhacker days remained strong, but Frank could see that Jesse was becoming consumed by the violence that had once been merely a means to an end. The gang's membership became increasingly unstable as original members were killed, captured, or decided to abandon the outlaw life. The younger brothers were arrested after a disastrous raid in Northfield, Minnesota, in 1876, leaving Jesse and Frank to recruit new members who lacked the loyalty and shared experiences of the original bushwhackers. These new recruits were often motivated purely by greed rather than political conviction, making them less reliable and more likely to betray the gang for reward money. The Northfield raid itself represented a turning point in Jesse James' career and psychology. The gang had planned to rob the First National Bank in Northfield, believing it would be an easy target in a small Minnesota town far from their usual Missouri territory. They were catastrophically wrong. The citizens of Northfield, many of them Civil War veterans themselves, responded to the robbery with organized armed resistance that transformed the raid into a running gun battle through the streets. The violence in Northfield was unprecedented even by the James gang standards. Two gang members, Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell, were killed in the initial exchange of gunfire. The Younger brothers were all severely wounded, with Bob Younger taking a bullet that shattered his elbow and Jim Younger suffering 5 separate gunshot wounds. The gang's retreat from Northfield became a desperate 2-week flight through unfamiliar territory, pursued by posses numbering in the hundreds. Jesse and Frank James managed to escape the Northfield disaster, but the Younger brothers were captured near Madelia, Minnesota. On September 21, 1876, the capture of the Youngers and the deaths of 2 other gang members left Jesse and Frank as the only survivors of what had been considered the most formidable outlaw gang in American history. The psychological impact of watching his criminal enterprise collapse in a single disastrous afternoon would haunt Jesse for the remainder of his life. The failure at Northfield forced Jesse to confront the reality that his outlaw career was unsustainable. The professional detective agencies, the expanding railroad networks that allowed rapid deployment of law enforcement, and the increasing sophistication of criminal investigation techniques all signaled that the days of successful outlaw gangs were numbered. Yet Jesse seemed psychologically incapable of accepting this reality and finding a way to transition to legitimate life. The years following Northfield saw Jesse become increasingly erratic and paranoid. He moved his family frequently, never staying in one location for more than a few months. He used multiple aliases, including Thomas Howard and J.D. Howard, and constructed elaborate cover stories about his background and profession. The constant lies and deceptions took a toll on his mental state, as he could never fully relax into any identity or relationship without fear of exposure. Jesse's relationship with his children became complicated by the demands of his fugitive existence. His son Jesse Jr. and daughter Mary grew up, knowing their father only through his various false identities and never understanding why they moved so frequently or why their father seemed perpetually anxious. Jesse struggled to be a present father while also maintaining the vigilance necessary for survival. The tender moments with his children were constantly interrupted by his need to watch the windows, monitor approaching strangers, and maintain escape routes. The financial pressures on Jesse's family intensified as his criminal activities became more difficult and dangerous. The large hauls from early robberies had been spent or lost, and Jesse found himself increasingly desperate for money to support his wife and children. This financial desperation drove him to take risks that his younger, more calculating self would have avoided. The careful planning that had characterized his early career gave way to more impulsive decisions born of immediate need. Jesse's attempts to rebuild his gang after Northfield brought him into contact with a different class of criminal. The men he recruited in the late 1870s and early 1880s lacked the ideological motivations and personal loyalty of the original bushwhacker-based gang. These new members saw Jesse primarily as a means to quick money, and Jesse, in turn, viewed them with suspicion and contempt. The mutual distrust within the gang made every operation more dangerous and less successful. The changing American landscape also worked against Jesse's continued success as an outlaw. The frontier was rapidly closing, with settlements expanding, telegraph lines connecting even remote areas, and railroad networks making rapid law enforcement response possible throughout the territories where Jesse had once operated freely. The Wild West that had provided cover and refuge for outlaws was being systematically tamed by the forces of industrialization and modernization. Jesse's deteriorating judgment became evident in his choice of targets during his final years. Rather than carefully selected banks in isolated towns with favorable political climates, Jesse began robbing trains and banks in more populated areas where the risks far outweighed potential rewards. These desperate choices reflected a man whose criminal career had become less about achieving specific goals and more about simply maintaining his identity as Jesse James, the legendary outlaw. The legend of Jesse James, carefully cultivated through sympathetic newspaper coverage and dime novel sensationalism, began to diverge dramatically from the reality of his increasingly disparate existence, while newspaper readers thrilled to romanticized accounts of his daring exploits. Jesse himself was living in constant fear, moving his family from one shabby rental house to another, and struggling to recruit gang members he could trust. By 1882, Jesse James had been reduced to working with a small group of inexperienced criminals, including Charlie and Robert Ford, brothers whose loyalty was questionable at best. Jesse's paranoia had reached pathological levels, yet his judgment had deteriorated so badly that he failed to recognize the greatest threat to his survival was living under his own roof. The man who had survived countless gun battles and evaded capture for 16 years was about to be killed by someone he had foolishly trusted. The mystery of Butch Cassidy's lost fortune, archaeological pursuit of the Wild Bunch's hidden treasure. As we settle deeper into our exploration of the Wild West's most enduring mysteries, we encounter a puzzle that has captivated treasure hunters, archaeologists, and historians for over a century. The question that has driven countless expeditions into the remote corners of the American West is deceptively simple. What happened to the enormous fortune accumulated by Butch Cassidy and his Wild Bunch during their decade-long reign as America's most successful train and bank robbers? Robert Leroy Parker, better known as Butch Cassidy, led what was arguably the most sophisticated criminal organization of the frontier era. Between 1896 and 1901, the Wild Bunch executed a series of robberies that netted them an estimated $200,000 to $350,000, an astronomical sum equivalent to millions of dollars in today's currency. Yet when the gang finally disbanded under pressure from relentless pursuit by law enforcement and Pinkerton detectives, virtually none of this wealth was ever recovered. The mystery deepens when we consider that unlike many outlaw gangs who spent their ill-gotten gains as quickly as they acquired them, the Wild Bunch demonstrated remarkable financial discipline. Contemporary accounts describe Butch Cassidy as a meticulous planner who understood that their criminal career would eventually end, either in capture, death, or voluntary retirement. He reportedly insisted that the gang save significant portions of their robbery proceeds for the day when they would need to disappear permanently from their outlaw lives. The Wild Bunch's most famous hideout was a remote valley in south-central Utah known as Robber's Roost, a natural fortress surrounded by maze-like canyons and mazes that provided perfect concealment from pursuing lawmen. Archaeological surveys of the area have revealed the remains of several camps and supply caches, suggesting that the gang used this location not just as a temporary refuge, but as a semi-permanent base of operations, where they could have safely buried substantial amounts of treasure. Dr. Carey Ross Boren, one of the leading researchers into Wild Bunch activities, spent decades studying historical documents, interviewing elderly residents of outlaw territories, and conducting archaeological investigations at suspected cache sites. His research revealed a pattern of behavior suggesting that Butch Cassidy and his associates systematically buried portions of their loot at predetermined locations throughout their operational territory, creating a network of hidden deposits that could be retrieved when needed. The evidence for these buried treasures comes from multiple sources. Bank records from the period show that the Wild Bunch's known expenditures accounted for only a fraction of their estimated robbery proceeds. Local folklore throughout Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, and surrounding territories contains remarkably consistent stories of outlaws bearing metal containers filled with gold coins and currency. Most compelling of all, several members of the Wild Bunch made deathbed confessions or left behind cryptic maps and written instructions describing the locations of hidden caches. Matt Warner, one of Butch Cassidy's closest associates and a founding member of the Wild Bunch, spent his later years as a respected lawman in Price, Utah, after serving a prison sentence for his outlaw activities. In the 1930s, as an elderly man reflecting on his criminal past, Warner told several confidants that the gang had indeed buried substantial amounts of money and gold throughout their territory. He described a systematic approach to cache creation, with each burial site carefully surveyed and marked using natural landmarks that would remain recognizable for decades. The most intriguing cache story involves the gang's final major robbery, the Union Pacific train holdup near Tipton, Wyoming. On August 29, 1900, this robbery netted the Wild Bunch an estimated $50,000 in unsigned banknotes, making it one of the most profitable train robberies in American history. Witnesses reported seeing the gang divide the loot into several portions immediately after the robbery, with some portions apparently set aside rather than distributed among the gang members. Historical detective work by researchers like Charles Kelly and Pearl Baker revealed that the gang maintained several supply and equipment caches throughout their operational area, often disguised as legitimate mining claims or homestead sites. These caches contained not just weapons and provisions, but also contained metal strongboxes and containers, suitable for protecting currency and coins from the elements. The logical inference is that at least some of these sites also served as treasure repositories. The challenge facing modern treasure hunters and archaeologists lies in the vast scope of the potential search area. The Wild Bunch operated across hundreds of thousands of square miles of some of the most remote and rugged terrain in North America. Their hideouts were chosen specifically for their inaccessibility, located in areas where pursuing lawmen would struggle to follow and where cached treasures could remain undisturbed for extended periods. Advanced archaeological techniques have been applied to the search for Wild Bunch treasure with varying degrees of success. Ground-penetrating radar surveys at suspected cache sites have revealed numerous buried metal objects, though most have proven to be abandoned mining equipment, natural mineral deposits, or more recent debris. Metal detectors have uncovered scattered coins and artifacts from the outlaw period, but nothing approaching the scale of treasure that historical evidence suggests should exist. The Browns Park area straddling the borders of Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming represents perhaps the most promising location for treasure hunters. This remote valley served as a winter hideout for the Wild Bunch and dozens of other outlaw gangs throughout the 1890s and early 1900s. Local ranchers and homesteaders reported numerous instances of suspicious nighttime activities in the area, with armed men seen digging in remote locations and transporting heavy containers to isolated canyon sites. Archaeological investigations in Browns Park have uncovered the remains of several outlaw camps, complete with stone foundations, fire pits, and middens containing artifacts from the appropriate time period. More intriguingly, researchers have found evidence of deliberate excavations at several sites, suggesting that outlaws did indeed bury items they intended to retrieve later. The fact that these excavation sites appear to have been undisturbed for over a century indicates that whatever was buried there was never recovered by its original owners. The scientific approach to treasure hunting in the Wild Bunch territories involves careful analysis of historical documents, topographical surveys, and environmental factors that would have influenced cache placement decisions. Outlaws would have chosen burial sites that were easily recognizable to them, but unlikely to be disturbed by casual passers-by or natural erosion. They would have needed locations accessible by horseback but concealed from observation, with natural landmarks that would remain stable over time. Geologist Dr. Bill Tennant has applied his expertise to the search for wild bunch treasure by analyzing the geological requirements for successful long-term cache storage. His research indicates that successful treasure burials would have required specific soil conditions, drainage patterns, and rock formations to prevent water damage and ensure retrievability. This scientific approach has narrowed the potential search areas significantly while increasing the probability of success. Modern technology has revolutionized the search for outlaw treasure. Satellite imagery allows researchers to identify geological features and landscape changes that might indicate historical human activity. GPS systems enable precise mapping of suspected cache sites and systematic search patterns. Advanced metal detectors can discriminate between different types of buried metal objects, helping to distinguish between worthless debris and potentially valuable finds. The legal complexities surrounding treasure hunting in the wild bunch territories add another layer of challenge to the search. Much of the area where caches are most likely to be found is now public land administered by federal and state agencies, requiring permits and compliance with archaeological protection laws. Private property rights must be respected, and any significant finds would likely be subject to complex ownership disputes between treasure hunters, landowners, and government agencies. Despite decades of searching by both amateur treasure hunters and professional archaeologists, the bulk of the wild bunch fortune remains missing. Some researchers theorize that Butch Cassidy himself may have retrieved some caches during his later years, possibly using the money to finance his rumored escape to South America. Others believe that the locations of the major treasure sites died with the gang members taking the secret to their graves. The environmental challenges of treasure hunting in the American West cannot be understated. The cache sites that were easily accessible to horsemen in 1900 may now be buried under decades of sediment, altered by flash floods, or obscured by vegetation growth. Natural landmarks that outlaws used as reference points may have been destroyed by weather, development, or natural geological processes. Recent archaeological discoveries have provided tantalizing hints about the wild bunch's treasure-catching activities. Excavations at the site of Cassidy's childhood home in Utah uncovered a buried metal container holding several $100s in period currency, suggesting that even as a young man, Butch understood the value of hiding money for future retrieval. Similar finds at other sites associated with gang members indicate that treasure burial was indeed a common practice among the wild bunch. The psychological aspects of the treasure mystery are as compelling as the archaeological evidence. The wild bunch operated during a period when paper currency was less trusted than gold and silver coins, making physical burial of wealth a logical preservation strategy. The gang members' backgrounds as working cowboys and miners would have given them practical experience with excavation and an understanding of geological conditions suitable for long-term storage. Contemporary newspaper accounts from the outlaw era contain numerous references to suspected treasure burial activities. The Vernal Express reported in 1901 that local ranchers had observed mysterious nocturnal excavations in remote areas frequented by known outlaws. The Price News described the discovery of recently disturbed earth and abandoned digging implements at several locations in the Bookcliffs region shortly after a wild bunch robbery. The mystery of Butch Cassidy's lost fortune continues to attract researchers, treasure hunters, and curious historians more than a century after the wild bunch's final dissolution. Whether the treasure remains buried in remote caches throughout the American West, was retrieved by surviving gang members, or never existed in the quantities suggested by historical accounts, the search itself has contributed significantly to our understanding of outlaw culture and the harsh realities of frontier life. Each expedition into the remote canyons and hidden valleys where the Wild Bunch once rode brings new archaeological discoveries and historical insights. Even when the ultimate prize remains elusive, the treasure hunt has become a lens through which we can examine the broader story of America's frontier period, when vast territories remained largely unmapped and a small group of determined outlaws could disappear into the landscape with fortunes that might still be waiting in the darkness below ground. The most compelling recent development in the search for Wild Bunch treasure involves the application of computer modeling and predictive analytics to historical data. Researchers at Utah State University have created sophisticated algorithms that analyze known gang movements, robbery patterns, geographical constraints, and historical weather data to identify the most probable cache locations. This scientific approach has reduced the search area from millions of acres to several thousand highly promising sites. One particularly intriguing lead emerged from the personal effects of Elsie Lay, one of Butch Cassidy's most trusted lieutenants, discovered in a New Mexico attic in 1987. Among Lay's papers was a hand-drawn map showing distinctive rock formations and water sources that matched the topography of a remote section of the Uinta Mountains in Utah. When researchers followed the map's landmarks, they discovered evidence of historical excavation at the indicated site, including rusted metal fragments and disturbed soil layers dating to the appropriate time period. The environmental forensics approach to treasure hunting has revealed that cache sites often display characteristic vegetation patterns that persist for decades after initial disturbance. Certain plant species colonize disturbed soil differently than undisturbed ground, creating subtle but detectable signatures visible in aerial photography and satellite imagery. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a forensic botanist working with treasure hunting teams, has identified several suspected cache sites based solely on anomalous vegetation patterns that suggest historical human activity. Local Native American communities have provided invaluable assistance to researchers seeking Wild Bunch treasure sites. Tribal elders possess oral histories that include detailed accounts of outlaw activities in areas that were largely unpopulated by white settlers. The Ute people, in particular, have shared stories, passed down through generations, about white men who came to their traditional territories to bury metal containers in secret ceremonies that resembled burial rituals. The psychological profile of treasure caches reveals important clues about probable hiding places. Studies of modern criminal treasure burial behavior indicate that people tend to choose locations within a specific distance range from their primary hideouts, usually between 2 and 10 miles. They prefer sites with multiple distinctive landmarks for navigation, elevated positions that provide good visibility of approaching threats, and soil conditions that facilitate both digging and drainage. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys in the hole-in-the-wall region of Wyoming have identified numerous buried metal objects in patterns consistent with intentional cache placement. While excavation permits are still pending, the preliminary data suggests a systematic arrangement of buried containers that match us. Historical descriptions of Wild Bunch treasure burial practices. The objects appeared to be buried at depths of 3 to 6 feet, exactly the range that would provide protection from surface disturbance while remaining accessible to the original depositors. The economic impact of treasure hunting in former outlaw territories has created an unexpected tourism industry that supports local communities throughout the American West. Guided treasure hunting expeditions, metal detecting workshops, and archaeological tours generate significant revenue for rural areas that have struggled economically since the decline of traditional mining and ranching industries. This economic activity has created stakeholders with vested interests in both preserving historical sites and continuing the search for undiscovered caches. International interest in wild bunch treasure has attracted researchers and treasure hunters from around the world, bringing diverse perspectives and technologies to the search. European archaeologists experienced in medieval treasure hunting have applied techniques developed for finding buried Viking hoards to American outlaw cache sites. Japanese researchers have contributed advanced soil analysis methods originally developed for earthquake prediction to help identify subsurface anomalies that might indicate buried treasure. The cultural significance of the treasure hunt extends far beyond the monetary value of any potential discoveries. The search itself has become a form of participatory archaeology that engages the public in historical research and preservation. Amateur treasure hunters often become knowledgeable historians, learning about frontier life, outlaw culture, and the social conditions that created the Wild West's lawless reputation. Climate change and environmental degradation pose increasing threats to undiscovered treasure sites throughout the American West. Increased frequency of flash floods, prolonged droughts, and extreme weather events are altering the landscape in ways that could destroy or relocate cached items. This environmental pressure has added urgency to archaeological efforts and created new partnerships between treasure hunters and environmental scientists working to preserve historical sites. The technology of treasure preservation itself provides clues about where outlaws might have hidden their loot. Contemporary accounts describe the wild bunch using sealed metal containers, often surplus military ammunition, boxes, or specially constructed steel cases, to protect currency and coins from moisture and deterioration. These containers would have been heavy and difficult to transport, suggesting that major caches would be located within relatively short distances of the gang's primary hideouts and travel routes. Forensic accounting of wild bunch robberies has revealed discrepancies that support the hidden treasure theory. Detailed analysis of bank records, railroad company reports, and contemporary newspaper accounts indicates that the gang's known expenditures account for only 30 to 40% of their estimated total robbery proceeds. This enormous gap between stolen amounts and documented spending suggests that the majority of the wild bunch fortune was indeed cashed rather than spent or lost. The role of trusted associates in maintaining treasure cache locations represents another fascinating aspect of the mystery. Historical research indicates that Butch Cassidy maintained relationships with several legitimate businessmen and ranchers throughout his operational territory, individuals who provided cover, information, and assistance in exchange for financial compensation. These associates may have been entrusted with knowledge of cache locations or even assisted in maintaining and protecting buried treasure sites during the gang's absences. The psychology of treasure burial reveals important patterns about likely cache locations. Studies of criminal behavior indicate that treasure burials typically occur during periods of high stress when outlaws feel immediate threats to their freedom or lives. The Wild Bunch experienced several such periods, particularly during intensive pursuit by Pinkerton detectives and law enforcement posses in 1900 and 1901. These high-pressure periods likely coincided with major treasure burial activities as the gang sought to protect their accumulated wealth from capture. Modern forensic geology has identified specific rock formations and soil types that would have been ideal for long-term treasure storage in wild bunch territories. Sandstone caves with good drainage, clay-rich soils that resist water penetration, and elevated sites protected from flooding all represent prime locations for treasure caches. Geographic Information Systems analysis has mapped these optimal conditions throughout the gang's known operational areas, creating prioritized search zones for modern treasure hunters. The economic incentives driving contemporary treasure hunting have created a small industry of professional searchers who dedicate their lives to solving the Wild Bunch mystery. These individuals combine historical research, archaeological methodology, and advanced technology in systematic searches that can span years or decades. While the odds of success remain low, the potential payoff from discovering even a single major cache justifies the investment of time and resources for many dedicated searchers. Legal precedents established through previous treasure discoveries in the American West have created a complex framework governing ownership rights to any Wild Bunch caches that might be found. Court cases from the 1950s through the present have established that treasure discoveries on public land may belong to the federal or state government, while finds on private property typically belong to the landowner or are subject to negotiated splits with the discoverer. These legal complexities mean that successful treasure hunters must navigate not just archaeological challenges, but also intricate property, law, and cultural heritage regulations. The documentation practices of the Wild Bunch themselves provide frustrating glimpses into their treasure-catching activities without revealing specific locations. Letters between gang members occasionally reference the packages we left in the usual places, or the deposits made during our last visit, using coded language that was clearly meaningful to the correspondence, but remains maddeningly vague to modern researchers. Cryptographers and linguistic experts have attempted to decode these references with limited success, as the gang members' personal knowledge of their territory made explicit directions unnecessary in their correspondence. Collaborative research networks connecting treasure hunters, academic historians, and archaeological institutions have emerged in recent decades, pooling resources and information in ways that previous generations of solo searchers could never achieve. These networks share ground-penetrating radar data, coordinate searches across jurisdictional boundaries, and combine historical discoveries that individually seem insignificant but collectively reveal patterns pointing toward probable cache locations. The seasonal timing of Wild Bunch activities provides another layer of evidence about treasure burial patterns. Analysis of robbery dates and gang movements suggests that major treasure burial activities most likely occurred during late autumn, when the gang was preparing for winter and seeking to lighten their loads before traveling to warmer climates or secure hideouts. This seasonal pattern helps narrow the temporal window during which specific cache sites would have been established, potentially aiding in archaeological interpretation of disturbed soil layers and artifact deposits. Life among the elite. How the wealthy survived and thrived in lawless territories and outro. As we reach the final portion of our journey through the harsh realities of the Wild West, we shift our perspective from the desperate struggles of outlaws to examine how the wealthy and powerful navigated these same dangerous territories. The contrast between the daily existence of bandits and the elite reveals the stark inequalities that defined frontier society and helps us understand why some chose the outlaw path, while others prospered within the system. The wealthy families who established themselves in Wild West territories faced many of the same environmental challenges as outlaws, but they possessed resources that transformed these obstacles into manageable inconveniences rather than life-threatening crises. Where an outlaw might die of exposure during a blizzard, a wealthy rancher could retreat to a well-built mansion with thick walls, imported glass windows, and multiple fireplaces burning seasoned hardwood shipped in by railroad from distant forests. Consider the daily routine of a cattle baron like John Chisholm in New Mexico or Charles Goodnight in Texas during the 1870s and 1880s. These men controlled vast territories, employed private armies of cowboys and gunmen, and wielded political influence that extended far beyond their ranches. Their mornings began not with the anxious scanning of horizons, for pursuing lawmen, but with reviewing reports from foremen managing thousands of head of cattle across holdings that dwarfed many eastern states. The contrast in housing alone illustrates the enormous gulf between outlaw existence and elite comfort. While Jesse James slept on the ground with a saddle for a pillow, wealthy frontier entrepreneurs constructed elaborate homes that rivaled anything found in New York or San Francisco. The Pabst Mansion in Milwaukee, the Copper King Mansion in Butte, Montana, and dozens of similar structures throughout the West featured imported marble, crystal chandeliers, and luxury furnishings that cost more than most outlaws stole in their entire careers. These mansions were not merely displays of wealth, they were fortresses designed to protect their inhabitants from the very outlaws we had been discussing. The elite understood that their prosperity made them targets, so they invested heavily in security measures that would have seemed fantastical to common settlers. Private guards patrolled the grounds. Specially trained dogs provided early warning of intruders, and many wealthy homes featured hidden rooms, escape tunnels, and concealed weapon caches. The dining experiences of the frontier elite stood in remarkable contrast to the meager rations that sustained outlaws during their desperate flights across the desert. Wealthy ranchers and mining magnates employed professional chefs imported from Europe, who prepared elaborate multi-course meals using ingredients shipped by railroad from around the world. Fresh oysters from the Atlantic coast, wine from France, and exotic spices from Asia graced tables in remote frontier territories where outlaws might go days without any food at all. Social entertainment among the wealthy created a parallel civilization that existed alongside but separate from the brutal realities of frontier life. Grand ballrooms in mining boomtowns hosted elaborate parties where guests wore the latest fashions from Paris and New York while just outside the windows. Armed guards patrolled to keep the less fortunate at bay. These social gatherings served not only as entertainment, but as business meetings where cattle contracts. Mining rights and political appointments were negotiated over champagne and imported cigars. The education opportunities available to elite families further widened the gap between their children and the offspring of common settlers, let alone outlaws. Wealthy frontier families hired private tutors, sent their children to exclusive Eastern boarding schools, and later to universities like Harvard and Yale. The children of cattle barons learned Latin, literature, and classical music, while the children of outlaws, if they survived childhood at all, received whatever education their fugitive parents could provide around campfires in remote canyons. Transportation represented another dramatic disparity between elite and outlaw experiences in the frontier West. While bandits relied on stolen horses and traveled light to avoid capture, wealthy families maintained stables of fine horses, imported carriages, and later private railroad cars that allowed them to travel in comfort and safety. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway built special stops at the request of major ranchers, and many wealthy families owned their own train cars, complete with bedrooms, dining areas, and armed guards. The medical care available to the frontier elite contrasted sharply with the complete lack of health care that outlaws endured. Wealthy families employed personal physicians, often graduates of Eastern medical schools who commanded substantial salaries for their willingness to practice in frontier territories. These doctors made house calls to remote ranchers, performed surgery in well-equipped private medical facilities, and had access to modern medicines and equipment that were completely unavailable to outlaws nursing their wounds in hidden caves. Banking and financial services that were completely inaccessible to outlaws formed the foundation of elite wealth accumulation in frontier territories. Major ranchers and mining entrepreneurs maintained accounts with multiple banks, invested in railway development, and participated in complex financial arrangements that allowed them to leverage their Western holdings into Eastern and European investment opportunities. While outlaws buried their stolen money in remote caches, the elite used sophisticated financial instruments to multiply their wealth exponentially. The legal protections enjoyed by wealthy frontier families created a system of justice that operated very differently for different classes of society. Cattle barons employed teams of lawyers who could navigate territorial legal systems, influenced local judges, and ensured that property disputes were resolved in their clients' favor. These same legal professionals worked to ensure that anti-outlaw legislation was written and enforced in ways that protected elite interests, while providing maximum penalties for those who threatened their property. Political influence allowed wealthy frontier families to shape the very laws that outlaws violated. Territorial governors, federal judges, and congressional representatives often owed their appointments to the support of major ranchers and mining interests. This political power enabled the elite to secure favorable legislation regarding land ownership, water rights, and livestock regulations, while ensuring that law enforcement resources were directed toward protecting their interests. The communication networks available to the frontier elite provided them with information and coordination, capabilities that far exceeded anything available to outlaw gangs. Private telegraph lines connected major ranches to business centers, allowing instant communication across vast distances. Professional courier services delivered mail and documents on regular schedules, and many wealthy families employed private intelligence networks that kept them informed about outlaw activities, political developments, and business opportunities throughout their territories. International connections distinguished the frontier elite from both common settlers and outlaws who remained trapped within American borders. Wealthy ranchers and mining entrepreneurs maintained business relationships with European investors, imported goods and services from around the world, and often owned properties in multiple countries. These global connections provided them with resources and escape options that were completely unavailable to outlaws, whose criminal records prevented any legal international travel. The contrast between elite comfort and outlaw desperation was perhaps most evident during harsh weather conditions that tested everyone's survival skills. While outlaws might freeze to death during blizzards or die of heat exposure in summer deserts, wealthy families retreated to climate-controlled environments with adequate food stores, medical supplies, and communication systems that could summon help if needed. Their survival was never in question, only their temporary comfort. Despite their comfortable circumstances, the frontier elite lived with constant awareness of the outlaw threat that surrounded them. Many wealthy families employed full-time bodyguards, maintained arsenals of weapons, and developed elaborate security protocols to protect themselves and their properties from bandit attacks. The irony was that their very success in accumulating wealth made them perpetual targets for the desperate men they had helped to dispossess through their control of land, resources, and political power. The psychological burden of wealth in lawless territories created its own form of stress for elite families. Unlike outlaws who faced immediate physical dangers, the wealthy faced the constant anxiety of protecting their accumulated assets from numerous threats, including theft, fraud, political upheaval, and economic collapse. Many frontier fortunes were lost overnight through poor investments, legal challenges, or simple bad luck in commodity markets. Children of elite families grew up in a strange bubble of luxury surrounded by violence and danger. They were educated about art, music, and literature, while learning to shoot firearms and recognize potential threats. Their childhoods included elaborate toys and games imported from Europe, alongside practical training in self-defense and emergency procedures. This unique upbringing created a generation of cultured individuals who were also hardened to frontier realities. The servants and employees of wealthy frontier families occupied a middle ground between elite comfort and outlaw desperation. Cowboys, house staff, and security personnel enjoyed regular wages, adequate food, and decent housing, but they also faced many of the same dangers as outlaws without any of the potential rewards from criminal activity. Their loyalty to their employers was often tested by outlaws seeking inside information or assistance with planned robberies. The economic relationships between the frontier elite and their surrounding communities created complex webs of dependence and resentment that often drove desperate individuals toward outlaw careers. Wealthy ranchers controlled access to water rights, grazing lands, and employment opportunities throughout vast territories. Small farmers and independent settlers found themselves increasingly squeezed out by the expansion of large-scale operations that could afford to wait out droughts, survive economic downturns, and purchase the latest agricultural equipment and livestock breeding stock. These economic pressures created a steady stream of displaced and desperate individuals who saw few alternatives to criminal activity. Young men who might have become successful small ranchers in earlier generations found themselves working as poorly paid ranch hands for wealthy cattle barons, watching enormous profits flow to their employers while they struggled to save enough money to purchase their own land. The psychological impact of this economic inequality cannot be understated in understanding why some chose the outlaw path. The frontier elite's relationship with local law enforcement was characterized by a level of influence and control that bordered on private ownership of public institutions. Wealthy ranchers and mining entrepreneurs routinely funded local sheriff's departments, provided equipment and supplies to territorial law enforcement agencies, and used their political connections to ensure that sympathetic individuals were appointed to key law enforcement positions. This created a system where legal authority was effectively privatized to serve elite interests. The cultural activities patronized by wealthy frontier families created isolated islands of Eastern sophistication in the midst of harsh Western realities. Private libraries and remote ranch houses contained thousands of volumes of classical literature, philosophy, and scientific texts that were completely inaccessible to the general population. Musical performances, art exhibitions, and literary salons provided intellectual stimulation for elite families, while the majority of frontier inhabitants remained focused on basic survival. Women within elite frontier families experienced a unique form of protected isolation that contrasted sharply with the dangerous exposure faced by the wives and female relatives of outlaws. Wealthy women traveled in armed escorts, lived in fortified compounds, and were shielded from direct contact with the violence and lawlessness that surrounded their protected enclaves. Yet this protection came at the cost of significant restrictions on their movements and activities, creating a gilded cage that was comfortable but confining. The educational advantages provided to elite children extended beyond formal schooling to include practical training in business management, political influence, and social networking that prepared them to inherit and expand their families' frontier empires. Private tutors taught not just academic subjects, but also the complex skills required to manage large-scale agricultural and mining operations, navigate territorial legal systems, and maintain the political connections essential for protecting family interests. The medical advantages enjoyed by wealthy frontier families included not just access to trained physicians, but also to the latest medical knowledge, pharmaceutical preparations, and surgical techniques available anywhere in the world. Private hospitals established by mining companies and cattle syndicates provided care that rivaled the best facilities in eastern cities, creating healthcare oases in territories where most residents had no medical care whatsoever. The architectural statements made by elite frontier homes served multiple purposes beyond mere comfort and status display. These elaborate structures functioned as psychological warfare against both outlaws and competing elite families, demonstrating the wealth and power necessary to construct and maintain such obvious targets in lawless territories. The very existence of these mansions sent a clear message about their owners: confidence in their ability to defend their possessions against any threat. International business connections maintained by frontier elite families provided them with economic diversification that protected them from the boom and bust cycles that devastated smaller operators throughout the West. European investors, South American mining interests, and Asian trading partnerships allowed wealthy American frontier families to maintain their prosperity even when local conditions became unfavorable, providing them with resources and options that were completely unavailable to outlaws or common settlers. The technological advantages enjoyed by wealthy frontier families extended far beyond basic conveniences to include cutting-edge innovations that fundamentally transformed their daily lives. Telegraph systems connecting remote ranches to urban business centers allowed instantaneous communication across thousands of miles. Private telephone lines, rare luxuries, even in eastern cities during the 1880s and 1890s, connected the homes of cattle barons and mining magnates to their business offices and to each other. These communication technologies provided strategic advantages in business dealings, allowed rapid response to threats, including outlaw activities, and maintained social connections that would have been impossible through traditional mail service alone. The water rights controlled by wealthy landowners represented, perhaps, their most valuable and contested resource in the arid territories of the American West. Elite families who secured control of rivers, springs, and underground water sources effectively controlled the viability of all surrounding lands. This water monopoly forced smaller ranchers and farmers into dependent relationships with the elite, creating economic hierarchies that mirrored feudal European systems. The conflicts over water rights often turned violent, with wealthy families employing armed guards to protect their water sources and intimidate those who challenged their control. The legacy-building activities of frontier elite families reveal their confidence in permanent establishment rather than temporary exploitation of Western resources. Wealthy families founded universities, established hospitals, endowed libraries, and constructed public buildings that bore their names and ensured their places in regional history. These philanthropic activities, while genuinely beneficial to developing communities, also serve to legitimize fortunes often built through questionable means, including land fraud, labor exploitation, and strategic violence against competitors. The contrast between elite children's experiences and those of outlaw offspring could not have been more stark. While the children of Jesse James and Butch Cassidy grew up in hiding, never knowing stability or security, the children of cattle barons attended exclusive Eastern boarding schools, traveled to Europe for cultural education, and made their social debuts in elaborate coming-out ceremonies that rivaled those of East Coast society families. These elite children inherited not just wealth, but also social capital, political connections, and educational advantages that virtually guaranteed their continued prosperity across generations. The private security forces employed by wealthy frontier families operated as semi-official militias that blurred the boundaries between legitimate law enforcement and private armies. These security organizations, sometimes numbering dozens or even hundreds of armed men, provided protection for ranch properties, escorted valuable shipments, and pursued rustlers and outlaws who threatened elite interests. The existence of these private forces created a parallel justice system where wealthy families could respond to threats without waiting for official law enforcement, effectively placing them above the territorial legal structures that governed ordinary citizens. The agricultural and ranching innovations pioneered by wealthy frontier operations transformed Western landscapes and economies in ways that persist to the present day. Elite families had the capital to invest in experimental livestock breeding programs, imported superior breeding stock from Europe and South America, constructed elaborate irrigation systems, and implemented scientific range management practices that smaller operators could never afford. These innovations increased productivity dramatically, but also raised the entry costs for ranching and farming to levels that effectively excluded those without substantial capital, further consolidating elite control of Western lands. The social season observed by frontier elite families created annual cycles of balls, dinner parties, horse races, and cultural events that mimicked the social calendars of New York and European aristocracy. These elaborate social rituals served multiple purposes beyond mere entertainment. They facilitated business networking, arranged marriages between prominent families, displayed wealth and status, and created exclusive social circles that reinforced elite solidarity while excluding outsiders. The expense of participating in these social seasons, requiring extensive wardrobes, hosting capabilities, and leisure time, effectively limited participation to the wealthiest families. The architectural evolution of elite frontier homes reflected both increasing wealth and growing confidence in the permanence of their establishment. Early cattle baron homes, while comfortable, were often relatively modest structures that could be abandoned if circumstances changed. By the 1880s and 1890s, wealthy families were constructing elaborate mansions using imported materials, employing prominent architects, and creating estates that were clearly intended to last for generations. These architectural statements declared the elite's intention to establish permanent dynasties rather than temporary exploitation of frontier resources. The hunting and sporting activities of frontier elite families transformed from necessity into elaborate rituals that demonstrated wealth, leisure time, and cultural sophistication. Organized hunting parties featuring European-style protocols, imported hunting dogs, and elaborate equipment turned the pursuit of game into social events that combined business networking with recreational display. Private game preserves stocked with imported exotic species, exclusive fishing clubs controlling access to prime waters, and elaborate sporting lodges rivaling European hunting estates all demonstrated the transformation of frontier survival activities into elite leisure pursuits. The educational institutions founded by wealthy frontier families served dual purposes of community development and elite perpetuation. Private academies established by mining magnates and cattle barons provided quality education to frontier communities while ensuring that elite children received instruction alongside carefully selected peers who shared similar backgrounds and aspirations. These institutions often featured curricula emphasizing classical education, European cultural traditions, and preparation for business leadership, creating educational experiences dramatically different from the basic literacy instruction available in common public schools. The marriage strategies employed by frontier elite families revealed sophisticated understanding of how to consolidate and expand wealth and power across generations. Arranged marriages between prominent ranching families merged vast landholdings and created powerful economic alliances. Marriages between Western elite daughters and Eastern or European Aristocracy provided social legitimacy and international business connections. These strategic unions were negotiated with the same careful attention to detail that characterized major business transactions, with prenuptial agreements, property settlements, and inheritance provisions, all carefully structured to protect and enhance family fortunes. As we conclude our exploration of the harsh realities faced by outlaws in the Wild West, the contrast with elite experiences illuminates the complex social dynamics that shaped this legendary period in American history. The same territories that proved fatal to countless outlaws provided the foundation for enormous fortunes that persist to this day. The same harsh environment that broke the spirits and bodies of desperate bandits was tamed and conquered by those with sufficient resources and determination. The Wild West was not simply a land of cowboys and outlaws, but a complex society where extreme wealth coexisted with desperate poverty, where sophisticated business enterprises operated alongside primitive survival struggles, and where the same dangerous territories could represent either doom or opportunity, depending on one's circumstances and choices. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the brutal realities of outlaw life in America's frontier territories. As you settle into sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream not of the romantic adventures depicted in Hollywood westerns, but of the gritty determination and human resilience that characterized those who lived and died in the real Wild West. If you enjoyed this exploration of boring history designed to help you relax and unwind, please remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more calming historical content. Share your thoughts in the comments about what historical period or topic you'd like us to explore next. And don't forget that you're an important part of our growing community of history enthusiasts. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be more peaceful than any outlaw ever enjoyed during their desperate flight across the unforgiving American frontier. Until next time, keep exploring the fascinating stories that history has to offer. And remember that even the most boring historical details can transport us to worlds far different from our own. Sleep well, fellow travelers through time.